Hello, everyone. My name is Alyce Weikel. I am currently an AP Access Spanish teacher in Cincinnati Public Schools, and today I'm going to be talking to you about ways that we can maximize Google Meet for our world language classrooms. I'll be talking about just some general control features and accessibility items. Then I'll move into ways that we can actually conduct our learning activities within Google Meet. And then finally, just a little preview of some of the updates that Google is rolling out. Some of us have some of them already, some of us do not. Again, this is, of course, focused on the world language classroom, but hopefully there'll be lots of tips and tricks that you can share with teachers of other disciplines as well. So again, we'll just go ahead and jump right in. So the way I have our presentation set up today, we have three chunks. The first is, again, going to be about controls and accessibility. So different ways that we can set up our Google Meets to maximize our time and to ensure that we're having the best possible experience for everyone involved. Then we'll move into features for learning, again, focused on our world language concepts, how we can use these items within the world language classroom. And then finally, we'll talk about the updates that are coming out from Google. And again, some of you may have some of these updates. I do not quite yet. It kind of just depends on the enterprise account that you are using. So we'll go ahead and jump in with our controls and accessibility. So the first item that I think is super important is just making it very easy for students to find your Google Meet. So you can open a new Google Meet by entering a nickname. And then if you, as the teacher, use that same nickname each time, students can use that same nickname and don't have to hunt down a new link every time. You don't have to post a different link every time in the LMS, whatever it may be. You can also control access that way. For instance, you have to be on a school-owned Google account to use the nickname to access. Each time that you as the teacher start a nicknamed account, a nicknamed Google Meet, it generates a unique code, so a unique website address, the meet.google.com/address. So someone outside of your school group cannot access that item using the nickname. So it's just kind of an additional feature to not only make it easier for everyone to access, but also to control a little bit who is able to enter in. So I have the screenshot here from the main Google Meet screens when you just go to meet.google.com. On the bottom there, of course, you have the little green icon that you can just start a new Google Meet with a random code, and it'll give you one of those meet.google.com/etc. links. Or if you use the nickname, again, each time you start it, you can use the same exact nickname. I've just named mine with my last name and then clase and then the period name. I also have an office hours one, so we have Weikel horas de oficina, so that students can join that, and it just kind of keeps things a little more streamlined. And rather than having to post a different link every time, it keeps things pretty easily accessible. And then there's fewer excuses for students not being able to make it to our Google Meet, and those sorts of things of I couldn't find the link sort of go away. So that's our first accessibility feature. And again, it is restricted to people within your school. So for instance, mine says only used within Cincinnati Public Schools. So they cannot use that nickname if they're on, say, their personal device. They'd have to log into their school account. And then again, the little code here, the dial-in number, the PIN, all of those sorts of things are different each time. So if a student wants to try to give it to their friend to meet bomb you the next time, the code is different. So just kind of keep that in mind. Second item to talk about, again, is just our general settings and control items. So this is our control panel. So once you're in a meeting, you'll click on those three dots on the bottom right, and this is the toolbar, as I call it. And most of our control and accessibility features that I'm going to be discussing are here. Again, a lot of these items that I'm discussing are things we already know. Just kind of refreshing our memory and also trying to make sure that we're maximizing them to our best use. So one of my favorite features of Google Meet is the accessibility as far as quick access. So automatically when you open a Google Meet, this is turned on, meaning that anyone can just kind of pop in as they join. So you have students coming in at various times as you're trying to do things. If you turn this off by just toggling that little item so that it turns off, you'll be able to have a little pop-up each time a student asks to join. So I think this is super helpful. It helps you with just being able to greet every student as they come in. It also helps me as far as keeping attendance. If you have 12 kids coming in right at the same time, it's a little difficult to mark down on your paper book or in your online grade book who was there at what time. So again, this is in the settings. So if you click on the little three dots on the bottom right of Google Meet, click on settings and go to host controls, you can just toggle that quick access off. As you can see here, it kind of explains a few different things that you as the host would join first. And then it just goes through some other items that kind of just, again, secure your account a little bit more, secure your Google Meet a little bit more. and then that way you can kind of monitor who's trying to come in. At times you might have students trying to join, a different class period, and if that's not something you're encouraging, you can just decline, and then they can join at their proper time. Perhaps you have set up certain office hours or things like that, and you have students coming at a certain time, and so you want to only allow that student in. You can leave everyone sort of, it's not really a waiting room with Google Meet like you have on Zoom, but it just kind of leaves them out of the meeting until you're ready to let them in. Next item is the record meeting option. So of course, big disclaimer here, you want to make sure that your school policy allows you to record things that involve students. A lot of schools will let you use it for educational purposes. So perhaps if you're posting on your LMS later so that students can come back and review a lesson, or for students who are absent. It offers just the option for you to maybe use a clip later on. So if you teach something live in Google Meet, and then someone was absent or someone needs to see that information again, you can just send them that clip. Again, it's great for just reviewing your own teaching, sharing ideas with colleagues, depending on how your administration is handling evaluations this year. This could be a nice option as well, to just maybe be able to send them a recorded class so that they can do their walkthrough or their official observation that way. Again, each school is different as to what you can do and not do. Typically, though, for the most part, if you record the meeting and use it for educational purposes, all should be fine. I will say that, for instance, with my students, cameras are off, so we're not sharing pictures. Of course, I wouldn't be recording and sharing out, to the wide world on the internet or Twitter or anything like that. I very rarely record my Google Meets, in fact. Right now, we are in a hybrid learning session, so we have one day virtual, and then we have 2 days of students in, and then 2 days of the other set of students in, so we're in a half and half mix. So occasionally I will record just myself speaking in a Google Meet. So perhaps if I introduce a new concept on that virtual day on Monday and not everyone can make it, I'll record just that part of the lesson. So maybe the 3 or 4 minutes where I introduce our new topic, or where I run through a grammar rule or whatever we may be doing, so that a student who's absent can access that later so I can play it in class. Again, just a nice option, especially for students that maybe need a little reinforcement. You can provide your lesson that you've done, just a recording of it. Another option that Google is rolling out, and they've actually just recently added in our languages, is the caption feature. So of course it's not perfect. If you've seen on YouTube, those auto-generated captions are not always great in any language, but it's a start. So if you have students that perhaps need a little bit of reinforcement as far as when you're speaking your target language, they can see those captions turned on. They're great if you're just trying to offer multiple inputs. So perhaps while you're speaking in your target language, you also turn on the captions so that students can hear you, they can see you through the camera, and they can see those captions as well. So they have multiple ways to try to gauge meaning. And again, it's auto-generated, so they're not always perfect. They're a little behind. If you're a quick speaker, as I am, sometimes you just have to kind of slow down and remind yourself that you're using those captions and they need a little bit of time to auto-generate. And again, as you can see here on the tweet that I've shared, they have updated to include some languages. So we have Spanish, French, German, and Portuguese at this point, in addition to English. So again, just a nice way to maybe reinforce what you're discussing in the target language. Another feature within our controls and accessibility is the ability to change the layout. So when you log into Google Meet, it has a default layout as to what you can see. This is really up to user preference. As I said, my students typically don't turn the cameras on. We don't require them to do so, and I'm totally fine with that. If we're engaged, that's fine. So for me, it's not super important to change the views because I'm just looking at icons for the most part. But you can adjust the number of tiles. You can rearrange them depending upon what you're doing that day. Maybe you're asking everyone to hold up one finger if it's true and two fingers if it's false, or something like that, or a thumbs up, thumbs down sort of listening exercise, and you want to be able to see everyone on their cameras, then you would want to be able to change so that you could see everyone. So as you can see at the bottom, you can change the number of tiles to display. You can also use the spotlight option, which I think is great on days when perhaps you have a student presenting via Google Meet. Also great if you're in a hybrid situation where you have some students at home. So you have some students on Google Meet and you have other students in front of you in a classroom. So you can put those students that are on Google Meet, if there's fewer of them or perhaps only one, you can put them in the spotlight, so then it's like a little closer, like they're there in class with you. And again, this just kind of comes down to user preference, and to me, depending upon what I'm doing during the day on Google Meet and what I want to be able to see on my screen. And again, as you can see here at the top, it is saved for future meetings. So if you change it for one day and you need something else the next day, it's going to be defaulted to what you previously had. So you can just go in and switch around between these different items and decide what works best for you. And another item with the controls and accessibility is changing your background. Google Meet is a little behind Zoom on this sort of thing, trying to get different items to be your background. Your Chrome does need to be updated for this to function. Right now, the blur background option, for some people, they only have the one version. As you can see here in the screenshot, there is like a slight blur and then a little bigger blur. That's just so if you don't want, if you're at home perhaps and you don't want them to see the pile of laundry behind you or whatever it may be. You can also use some stock photos, as you can see here. Additionally, Google Meet has the option for you to upload your own background. There will be a plus sign in like the bottom right, so underneath the stock photo items. Again, some users are seeing this and some are not. Currently, I do not have this on my school account, but on my private Gmail account, I do. So I think it's just a difference of rollout between different enterprise levels, regular Google versus Google for Education, that sort of thing. So if you have the upload your ability there with the plus sign, this is a great way to bring in things like a digital word wall. There's a lot of great items available pre-made that you can use to just kind of reinforce what you're teaching, so that kind of mimic what you might do in the classroom, where you would have words written perhaps on the whiteboard behind you that you could point to and reference. So I have a few anchor charts that are digital that I can use as a background. When I have the option, sometimes I have to log in with my personal account to be able to upload, as I said, because my school one at the moment doesn't have this plus sign option. So this is not technically something that's in this new round of upgrades that Google has announced that we'll discuss later. But again, some of us are seeing it on our school Google accounts and some are not. So just something to kind of keep an eye on. If you do have this option, again, changing your background to include an anchor chart or a little word wall, something to that effect. This is another great way to improve accessibility and access to the language as you're using it, so that you can reinforce just as you would in the classroom with an anchor chart on the wall. And again, one that we're all pretty familiar with is the sharing your screen option. So you can share the resources you're using. You can pop over to the LMS. You can walk students through the website that you're having them do a web quest with. You can share slides as your organization. We're all pretty familiar with this now that you're into this digital virtual learning. You do have a choice between 3 items when you do the present now. So just a quick reminder that that bottom choice where it says best for video and animation is super useful when you're trying to share a video or perhaps an audio clip, that sort of thing. And again, just depending on your goals for the day, whether you want to share your entire screen so that you don't have to keep switching between tabs and click again, switch to this tab to share. So again, lots of different choices. And again, students have this option as well. So you can kind of walk them through depending upon what or anything if you want them to share. And again, you can toggle that on and off. So depending on your students, you may want to just turn that off. Again, this is in the host controls through settings. If you don't want them to be able to share their screen on a given day. But it is great for different things if you're brainstorming, if you're having them do presentations, if you've talked them through how to access a website and a student's struggling or it's not coming up for them. We've all had thousands of technical glitches this year. So when a student says, I'm not seeing that assignment, or my screen looks different from yours, those sorts of things, you can just make sure that they can share their screen. And then again, this just improves accessibility for everyone and keeps things moving more smoothly. So using Google Meet as a way to be the tech support for a student across town is just another great way to maximize its abilities. So again, just a bunch of different controls and accessibility issues, how we can get students in, how we can support their learning. We're now going to move into specific ways we can stay within the Google Meet platform and use its features to improve learning experiences for students. So a main goal of mine this year, as we've been having virtual and then hybrid and then back to virtual and now we're back to hybrid, is trying to minimize the number of windows they have open, trying to minimize the number of different websites, those sorts of things that they have to go to. So when we are holding classes virtually on Google Meet, I think it's super important to try to conduct as much as we can through Google Meet. So there are some features within Google Meet that we can maximize to really use for input and output of the target language. And then students don't have to click around to a variety of websites or have the LMS open and 3 other tabs and their Google Meet as they're trying to manipulate everything. So our features for learning, the big one that I think everyone probably uses to some extent is the chat. Again, it's a great place to share links. If you are going to another website, if you're having them use an authentic resource, if you are having everyone work on the same Google slideshow, perhaps you could just drop the link in there. You can drop links to a Quizlet practice, whatever it may be that you're doing. It's just a great way to get that information to students quickly. Students, of course, in the chat can respond to things that you said. They can ask their own questions. You can use it for them to give ratings on themselves, a self-assessment. All of that can be done right there in the chat. So things that you could do in the classroom in person, you can just replicate here in chat. It's also great for students that are reluctant to unmute themselves. As I mentioned previously, most of my students have their cameras off, and actually most of them are muted as well. And so we use the chat as the way to have our participation. So as I'm speaking, of course, my camera is typically on, my audio is on. I will ask them to respond in the chat. Tell me in the chat what you're working on, or tell me in the chat what you thought of that assignment, or I'll ask a specific question, de qué color es, like what color is, whatever it may be, and just get some responses going in the chat. If you do need to monitor chat, you can minimize the distractions. You can also turn it off. So if you're trying to perhaps conduct an activity and students are busy typing in the chat instead of paying attention to the activity you're doing, you can just turn that off. Again, that's back in the host controls, the same place where you had the quick access and where you have the ability to turn on and off students' ability to share their screens. Again, the only drawback I have so far to chat is that you don't have any way to save it other than just copying and pasting the whole thing into a document. You don't get a readout later when you get your Google Meet report as to who attended. You don't get a transcript, those sorts of things. So if you're using chat to conduct items for formative assessments or even summative assessments, or if you're just trying to keep track of, who asked what questions or who participated, you're going to need to copy and paste out the chat transcript before you end the Google Meet. So to me, that is one drawback, but it's a great way, like I said, to do lots of different things. You can share items to students, they can share items back. It's a great way to keep everyone on the same page. So for instance, a lot of websites now are offering just a quick link. So if you wanted to play Quizlet Live, for instance, they're offering just a direct link now that you can just drop right into the chat, versus previously you would have to tell them, go to quizlet.live, enter this code, and it would take a lot longer than if it's just, hey, everyone click this link. So the chat is a great way to keep class moving forward, especially if you are trying to go to other websites. You can minimize some of those struggles by just giving them a direct link. And again, I like it for just giving different sorts of resources. Here's a reminder what your vocab looks like, or here's a link to that video we watched yesterday. We're going to compare the commercial we're watching today with the commercial from yesterday. So here's the link from yesterday if you were absent. Just kind of keep class moving forward and putting everything in the chat instead of having students have to reference perhaps back to your LMS, back to something else. Another feature for learning is the Q&A. This is over to the right of the chat where you have the three shapes. The bottom item there, Q&A. So as it says, it gives everyone an easy way to ask questions. So you can post questions for the class, and then students can also post their own question. So when that is active, if someone has asked a question, students will see a little green dot next to the Q&A to just sort of tell them, hey, remember this is available to you. There's a question here, whatever it may be. Students can also upvote a question. So perhaps you have a warm up where you ask students, 2 minutes to ask me any questions about our current content. And then students can say like, yeah, I agree with that question. I need help with that question too. And so then they would just upvote the little thumbs up here so you can answer things in order of upvotes. You can maybe just reemphasize like, hey, whoever typed this question, thank you for doing that because 8 of your classmates agreed with you that that's something we need to discuss, whatever it may be. And then you can also hide the question. You can mark it as answered, or you can completely delete it. So perhaps somebody asked something that isn't really relevant at the moment. You can hide that question pretty quickly. One awesome feature of this Q&A, which is pretty similar to chat, like you would still answer the questions in the chat, or you can answer them verbally. You will receive a question and answer report via email, so you will get a list of those questions. So you'll kind of get a reminder as to what questions were asked, information you had to review. It will tell you who posed the question, so you can see like, were a variety of students asking questions, or were all 5 questions from the same student, that sort of thing. Okay. My favorite of the items within Google Meet is the polls. So I've really been maximizing these a lot this year and using them a lot. You can pose multiple choice questions to the class through this polls option. And again, it's over to the right of the chat where the 3 shapes icon is. So You can type the question and launch it immediately, or you can save it for later. So sometimes I'll hop into my Google Meet like 5 minutes before it's supposed to start. I'll turn off the quick access so a student can't just interrupt me in the middle of trying to type these out. And I can get things pre-set up for the class. So perhaps I know we're going to start with a little warm up of 3 vocabulary items, fill in the blank. I can get those created and saved so that I can launch them once I'm running class. You can display the results either during or after voting or not at all. So that's kind of up to you if you want to see students' answers live, if you want students to be able to see each other's answers. Again, they're all anonymous, but if you're asking a multiple choice question and there's clearly a clear answer that is winning and you don't want to necessarily sway other students' opinions or ideas, you might just keep the responses hidden until you're ready to discuss them. You can just verbally discuss. You don't have to display them at all. As students vote in the polls within Meet, it is completely anonymous. So that kind of reassures students that it's okay if you miss an answer, or it's okay. Perhaps I'm asking like, did you like our lesson yesterday? Yes or no? And if students afraid to be honest, be like, no, go ahead, throw it out there. So there's a caveat to that. It's anonymous within Meet, but after the meeting, when you receive your Meet report, and then you do receive also a spreadsheet of all of the responses to the polls, and you will get names with that. So again, this is a great way to get data. So if you're asking just a quick couple questions as a formative assessment, maybe just a check-in on vocabulary, you can get a quick then read of who was able to do well on that and who maybe struggled a little bit. So you have this little informal way to gather data, and students are just answering little survey questions or little polls. So as far as tying it to our world language classrooms, there's a couple ways we can do it. It's great for content. So as I mentioned, vocabulary fill in, great for opinion questions. Also true false, of course, or maybe you're voting on like your favorite. So things like your Navidad Madness or March Madness song brackets. Perhaps you're giving students a choice between 2 sets of vocabulary to study next. They can choose their selections that way. The polls are also great for just sort of like a warm up or an SEL sort of check in for housekeeping items. So maybe just a quick, how are you doing today? Bien, mal, más o menos, those sorts of things. It's good for a self assessment. So, I would rate my abilities with the future tense as, and then give them 3 or 4 choices, right? I'm awesome at this. I'm pretty good at this. I'm fine at this. I can do this with my notes, however you want to word the different things that work for you as far as assessing. It's also great for relationship building. I use the polls a lot for warm-ups for just random sorts of questions. Around Christmas, we did things which one of these Christmas movies is the worst, and they had to vote for which one they liked the least, and then we could have just a quick chat, just a quick check-in, like, oh, I agree, I don't know why those movies are, whatever, just to kind of get students talking, connecting with you. Especially this year, it's been difficult in many cases if you are virtual or hybrid or some amalgamation therein to really get relationships going. So the polls allow you to just have a quick little way to get to know your students a little bit better. And again, because you get those results at the end, you get the spreadsheet. If a student votes on something, you then kind of know later on, like, oh, Jimmy really likes pizza, or Susie really doesn't like pizza, whatever it may be. And just these little things you can kind of store away to use later on. So some photos here of some polls, just so you can kind of get a feel for how it looks. So for an SEL check-in there on the left, I did this one in the target language. So you can see it's just a little fill in the blank. So the student would just vote on those 3 things. As you can see here at the bottom, you can click on the little toggle so that the results will show up. In that case, I would probably not display that one just because it doesn't really affect anyone else, how everybody else is doing in the class. But again, if you do this pretty frequently, and you might start to notice some patterns in those spreadsheets. If you use this question as a warm-up every day, and you see that, Maria is saying mall every single day, you might just take a moment to send an extra email and be like, hey, just want to check in, that sort of thing. So it's a nice way to get some of these SEL things virtually that perhaps are a little more difficult to do. The middle option here, this is from our kind of modified Navidad Madness from this past winter. I took some of the older commercials and mixed them with some newer ones, and we did our own little bracket virtually. And so we use the polls as a way to vote, whereas often I might have used like Mentimeter or another outside resource for polling or for voting, or maybe just had students type it in the chat. This way it was just nice and clean. Which one do you prefer? And they're also getting reinforcement of the target language. So they see prefiero, they see a stem change verb, for instance. We're reinforcing our vocab of enuncio, And then, of course, they have the names of the 2 announcements there, the 2 advertisements. Over on the right, this is from our most recent unit in my Spanish 3 class. We are working with the past tense and dealing with like legends and fairy tales and that sort of stuff, just trying to keep it a little fun and light, because February and March are always kind of dark and rough anyway. So here we're just reinforcing some vocab. So they're seeing a sentence with a blank and then 4 of our vocabulary items so that they can vote for the correct answer. And again, if we don't show everyone the results, they don't necessarily just all pile onto whichever answer is winning. So they still need to make their own selection. And again, it's anonymous within Meet. So when you do share the results, perhaps when you're going over the answers and you share the results after you've ended the poll, then everyone can kind of see like, oh, everyone was towards the right answer or whatever it may be. And again, at the end, when you receive that spreadsheet back, you'll be able to look for patterns and see, oh, Timmy got everything awesome. He did great on this one. He told me he wasn't doing great with the vocab, but according to this poll, he is. So again, you get this data that you can follow up on later with students. So I really like the polls just because it's a quick, easy way, like I said, to get a lot of data and an easy way to get participation. So even if you have students with their cameras off and muted, this is another way, in addition to the chat, that you can get them engaging with content and engaging with you. You can even just use the polls for simple little things. Perhaps you use a speaking activity, right? And so you read a sentence and the student has to just vote logical or illogical, or verdad or mentira, or whatever it may be, truth or lie. So you can just have the same poll item over and over again, and they're just voting, okay, sentence 1, I say this, you tell me is that logical or illogical, and then go to sentence 2. And so it's just a quick way to get a bunch of data to get students engaging with the input that you're giving them and for them to give output in a very low-key manner. So like I said, polls is my favorite. I've spent a little bit of time on this one. I think it's super important. And here are some spreadsheet results. So the top one there, as you can see, this was from our Navidad Madness at the end of December. So this is 4 students voted. As you can see, I had 5 students total that day participating, and not a single student actually answered each polling item. So sometimes that happens, but again, that's just some more informal data you can use. So if a student is in your Google Meet but not responding to poll items, not answering the chat, again, they're not super engaged. So you have these sorts of things to be able to circle back with them and say, hey, I saw you didn't vote on, for instance, your grand champion for Navidad Madness. What's up there? Did you not like either of them? Whatever it may be. The bottom one here then, this again ties with our Navidad Madness. So the first 2 items were earlier in our bracket. They were choosing between the 2 items. And then we also did some vocabulary reinforcement. So we had some sort of winter holiday vocabulary going on. And then we were also working with the future and conditional tense, because in addition to Navidad Madness, to the Christmas commercials, we were also working with Spanish lottery commercials. And so I made the connection there to, if I won the lottery, I would, or when I win the lottery, I will. Just kind of a simple grammar thing for my Spanish 3s as we ended that first semester. And so again, I could offer them an English translation as the poll item. I will open, and then they had different choices as to what the correct verb form would be. So I could look through these and kind of know, like, okay, I still have some students mixing up the present with with future with the conditional, or whatever it may be. So those are things I could circle back on. So for instance, like they would decorate, I can see everyone that voted was correct. So then right in the meeting, as I see those poll results coming in, because I can see exactly how the votes are going, you can reinforce like, great, good, that EIN or IAN ending is the conditional, great job, et cetera, et cetera. Just kind of reinforce for students. And vice versa, if you see a poll kind of trending the wrong way, in that very moment, you can just reteach real quick. So if I ask that question, they would decorate and everyone's choosing, or they tend to be leaning towards the wrong way. For instance, I just said everyone had this correct, and I see now that one did not, my mistake. I can kind of reinforce like, oh, remember the conditional is IAN or whatever it may be. So you can always give just a quick reinforcement, especially when answers are trending in the wrong direction. The next feature for learning is Jamboard, which again, a lot of us are using independent of Google Meet, but it is integrated right into Google Meet. So again, instead of having to have students open a different window or provide them a link, you can just go ahead and open it directly from Jamboard. They do have the option, as you can see here, to just start a brand new one. So maybe in the middle of a discussion, you're like, hey, let's use a brainstorm on a Jamboard, and just open a brand new one. Or if you have one pre-made that you want to use, perhaps you have a Venn diagram already set up and you want students to add items to it, or however you're using Jamboard, you can choose one from your drive immediately. And again, you can also just throw a link to the Jamboard into the chat if you have it already ready to go. And they're great. It's a great way, again, for collaboration, and especially if class kind of takes you in that direction. So you weren't thinking about using a Jamboard that day, but then you realize that some collaboration in that sort of space would be great. You can just open it right there from Google Meet. Everyone can access it, and you don't lose any instructional time, and you just kind of keep rolling with things. I'm going to stop back for a second. I did leave out our breakout rooms in our discussion here just because I feel like a lot of teachers are using those, and that's kind of its own presentation in itself. I will just comment briefly on the breakout rooms that it kind of comes down to your students and what your goals are and that kind of thing. Keep in mind that breakout rooms are a great way to get students to engage with one another, but in the virtual space, a lot of times they're not, in fact, speaking to one another in those breakout rooms. They can still use the chat in there, so a lot of the features we've discussed here still apply in the breakout rooms, right? They can still use the chat to talk to one another. You can still pop in and drop in links and that sort of stuff in the chat. But again, I didn't go too deeply into breakout rooms because I feel like that can be its own separate presentation. So I really want to talk about Google Meet today as an entire class, keeping everyone together. Again, if you do use the breakout rooms, keep in mind that a lot of the things we've discussed do apply within those breakout rooms. You can still use the chat, you can still drop in links, you can still pop in and talk to them, but things like polls and the Q&A, those sorts of things disappear once students are into those breakout rooms. Final thing I want to talk about with you today is some updates that are coming from Google. As I said at the top of the presentation, Google has announced some rollouts. Some people have them, some people don't. Some people have bits and pieces of them. Everything's kind of a process. As of the time that I'm recording this with my school account, with my Google for Education account, I do not yet have these updates. So unfortunately, I can't show you these in action quite yet. The only update that I do have, which actually just popped in yesterday, so I misspoke, I do have the end meeting for all option now. So previously, if you ended a meeting and students were still in it, they could technically still access that Google Meet room with that specific code sometimes. Again, gray area depending upon if you're using a nickname or not, depending upon if students were on their school accounts, et cetera, et cetera. Now they have the option when you click that little hang up button, when you click end meeting, there's a little pop-up that says, like, do you want to just leave meeting or do you want to end meeting for all? So instead of having to kick students out, like remove them from the meeting before you ended the meeting so that no one was left in the room and then the room would therefore not exist anymore, you can now just end meeting for all. So it's a little time-saving option. Just if you have a few students hanging around who aren't responding, sometimes that happens. You know, students lose interest, they walk away from the computer, something else comes up, maybe the computer's frozen, and so you have to remove them from the room. Now you don't have to do that, so you can just end meeting for all. Especially if you have classes back to back and you need to get to a different class or whatever it may be, that's a nice feature. They are rolling out meeting transcripts, which would be based upon similar to the auto-generated captions that I discussed early in this presentation. As you can see here, that is going to be a paid feature. So that would be up to your district as to whether they're getting that item. In the grand scheme of things, it could be a nice option for sure. But you do have some other resources there that you could use as far as trying to get versions of what happened in your meeting. And many of us were conducting so many Google Meets that having endless transcripts is not necessarily going to be something that we want. You will have the option to mute all. So if you have students who do actually unmute, which is great, and perhaps you're giving them, a few moments to discuss something or have everyone unmuted so that they can respond to a question or repeat something after you, whatever it may be. And then you're moving to a different sort of activity and you need everyone to be quiet, you can click that mute all. So again, just a quick little time-saving thing. Instead of having to click through each student and mute them, you can mute all. Again, I don't have that feature yet, but I know some other teachers in different districts do. So we're all just kind of waiting our time to get these items. Google Meet is also rolling out emoji reactions, so that'll get students perhaps engaging differently. For our foreign language, for our world language classrooms, this will be great for like a thumbs up, thumbs down sort of activity. So if they're agreeing or disagreeing with a statement that you're making in the target language, perhaps, they can use those emojis instead of actually having their camera on doing thumbs up, thumbs down. You could use it for, showing preferences, sharing opinions, those sorts of things. I think it'll just be a nice way to get a little bit more engagement. Again, as I've mentioned multiple times, for the majority of my students, we are cameras off muted, which is fine. That's what works for them. This would just be another way to elicit some response and to elicit some participation. And again, Google Meet, this little slide from them does say and more. So there are some other options that are coming out from Google Meet. And Google's also very receptive to hearing ideas from educators, so you can always reach out and share some items that you think would be helpful. For instance, as I mentioned, I didn't go too deeply into breakout rooms because a lot of the features and things that I've mentioned today about using Google Meet for our students don't actually transfer to the breakout rooms apart from the chat. So I've emailed them and just mentioned some of the things that I think would be helpful to carry over. I think if we could perhaps do a Q&A back to the main room, some other different things. Students can request your help and they can raise their hand and that sort of thing from the breakout room. But for me, I think that might be a nice addition. So again, thank you so much for listening to me today. If you have any questions or comments, want to collaborate, whatever it may be, here's my contact information. As I said, I do work for Cincinnati Public Schools, so that is CPSBOE down there, Cincinnati Public Schools Board of Education. If you have any ideas, further things that you think have been great for you on Google Meet, I'd love to hear them. Again, I'm just continuing to kind of experiment with it and figure out what works best for my students, and what works for my students may not work for yours, and what's working for your students might be great for mine, or vice versa. So just sharing ideas is always great. There's my Twitter handle as well. Thank you so much for listening today and attending. I do appreciate it. And again, if I can answer any questions, clarify anything, help with anything, please feel free to reach out. Thanks so much for your time. Have a great rest of your day.